I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the UN Security Council debates Russia's latest airspace violations, we ask why Estonia held fire, unlike Turkey in 2015, before hearing frontline perspectives from Ukrainian soldiers and exploring Russia's answer to the Eurovision Song Contest.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 22nd of September, 3 years and 212 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and for a broader strategic assessment of the front lines, the Kyiv Independent's Francis Farrell. But first, over to Dom for the latest on the military situation.
The main defence story over the weekend was the response to Friday's incursion into Estonian airspace over the Gulf of Finland by those 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets. So these 3 flew unimpeded for about 12 minutes, we're told, before departing. At least one of them was thought to be armed. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Italy, Finland and Sweden scrambled jets under NATO's new Operation Eastern Sentry mission, the mission to bolster the eastern flank, or the front line, whichever way you prefer. I prefer the latter. A NATO spokesperson said it was, quote, yet another example of reckless Russian behaviour and NATO's ability to respond. So then on Saturday, Estonia's Defence Minister Hanno Pevkur, he was speaking to Estonian media outlet ERR. He said NATO's response to the incident had demonstrated the alliance is prepared to use force if necessary. He said, we saw on Friday that NATO is functioning very efficiently, even to the point that if we were truly forced to use the last resort, which is the use of force, then there was a readiness for that as well. So he was asked a question and he said, this is exactly what Russia wants, to divert our attention away from helping Ukraine and to focus on our own backyard. That is a key goal behind these kinds of provocations. Possibly not the strongest response, but I interviewed Mr. Pevkur earlier this year, just after there'd been another incident when a single Russian fighter had flown through Estonian airspace only for a minute that time. This was back in May. I asked if he was prepared then to shoot it down, and he said he was. But he said with only a minute to respond, that option wasn't available. I've checked back. That interview went out on May the 28th podcast, so do have a listen back to the interview with Hanno Pevkur, Estonia's defence minister, on a very similar issue to what happened over the weekend. Anyway, still responding to the incident on Saturday, Czech President Petr Pavel, he said NATO should respond to such provocations by shooting down planes. So Mr. Pavel is a former chairman of NATO's military committee, former general. He said, unfortunately, this is a balancing act bordering on the edge of conflict, but one simply cannot retreat in the face of evil. Then Estonia called for the enactment of NATO Article 4. Now, Article 4 is the formal mechanism to get the 32 members to consult on an issue. No date yet for that consultation. That Article 4 was last enacted a couple of weeks ago by Poland after the drone incursion. So it has happened before. It's very different to Article 5. But before that one, 2 weeks ago, Article 4 had not been enacted since the start of the full-scale invasion. So it shows it is quite rare. Then, as Francis says, the UN Security Council is convening later today to discuss this issue. That meeting is due to start at 10 a.m. local time in New York, so that's 3 p.m, 1500 here local in London. Estonia's Foreign Minister Markus Tsahkna is expected to make a statement just ahead of that meeting. But I got in touch with Mr. Tsahkna this morning. I asked what he was going to say and any comment to offer. He gave me a statement referring to this afternoon's Security Council meeting. He said the airspace violation by 3 Russian jets last Friday was one of the most serious incidents in recent years. By entering Estonian and therefore NATO airspace for 12 minutes, Russia violated Estonia's territorial integrity and breached the UN Charter, which prohibits the threat or use of force. He said Russia is undermining principles that are essential to the security of all UN member states. It's therefore crucial that such actions, especially when committed by a permanent member of the Security Council, are addressed within this very body, referring to the Security Council. He said this airspace violation is part of a wider pattern of Russian behaviour aimed at testing the resolve of Europe and NATO. Just days earlier, 19 Russian drones entered Polish airspace and a Russian attack drone remained in Romanian airspace for an hour. These are not isolated incidents, but parts of a broader pattern of escalation by Russia, both regionally and globally. Such behaviour demands a strong international response. He finished by saying, Russia's conduct is incompatible with the responsibilities of a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So I got the feeling he was kind of rehearsing his statement for later on. But thank you, Mr. Sackner, for sharing it with us first. I guess that might be a global exclusive, don't know. Anyway, there we go. We will hear more from him later, and then the actual council meeting at 3 p.m. Now then, after these incursions, Poland and other allies, as I said, scrambled jets on Saturday morning after a Russian airstrike near Ukraine's western border. The Polish armed forces said on Saturday, Polish and allied aircraft are operating in our airspace, while ground-based air defence and radar reconnaissance systems have been brought to the highest state of readiness. Now, at the time, nearly all of Ukraine was under air raid alert, so this is Saturday morning, as I said, following warnings of Russian missile and drone attacks by Kyiv's air force. Polish military officials stressed that operation was preventative and aimed at securing airspace in areas adjacent to the threatened area. I said that in a statement. That operation ended about 7 a.m. local on Saturday morning. However, those attacks they were responding to, the overnight attacks Friday, Saturday, killed at least 3 people, targeting the country's civilian areas, according to President Zelensky. He said the enemy's target was our infrastructure, residential areas and civilian enterprises. Each such strike is not a military necessity, but a deliberate strategy by Russia to intimidate civilians and destroy our infrastructure. He was referring to the overnight attacks that hit Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Chernihiv, Poltava, Kyiv, Odessa, Sumy and Kharkiv. He said a missile equipped with cluster munitions had hit a building in the city of Dnipro in the middle of the country. Then on Sunday, there was another potential airspace incursion. NATO scrambled the German Quick Reaction Alert Detachment, which consisted of 2 Eurofighters, to investigate an unidentified aircraft that was operating without a flight plan and not in radio contact in international airspace. So German forces later visually identified the plane as a Russian IL-20M, Ilyushin 20M reconnaissance aircraft. The German Air Force didn't specify where over the Baltic Sea the incident had occurred, but the German delegation to NATO said that after visually identifying it as an Ilyushin 20M, they handed over the escort to Swedish partners. Inside the country over the weekend, very little movement on the ground. That the Dobrapia pocket, that bit in the Donbass where Russia advanced some kilometres to the north a few weeks ago, continues to be sliced and degraded by Ukraine. An interesting point made by Phillips O'Brien of St Andrews University in his weekend update, contrasting the relative speed and efficiency with which Ukraine's counterattack to that Russian advance in the vicinity of Dobrapia contrasts markedly with the almost a year that it took Russia to eject Ukrainian forces from the Kursk incursion. A year plus, of course, 12,000 North Korean soldiers. How could we forget them? Anyway, connected to that, we're here today that Putin has reportedly sacked the former Northern Group of Forces and Leningrad Military District Commander, Colonel General Alexander Lapin, from military service. So Lapin had been in command of the Kursk district at the time of Ukraine's invasion in August last year, and had previously been in charge of the Russian forces that had to retreat in the face of the Ukrainian advance in the northeast and Kharkiv area in the autumn of 2022. Now we're told that General Lapin has not just been reassigned, but sacked from military service completely, which is quite an unusual move. On the ground over the weekend, Ukraine also continues to attack in the vicinity of Sumy, closing that pocket of Russian-held land inside Ukraine in that area. And then footage released yesterday by Ukraine reportedly shows 3 Russian Mi-8 helicopters, the HIP, the transport helicopter. They can be armed as well, but they're mainly transport. 3 Mi-8 helicopters and a Nebo-U radar destroyed in Crimea. This is said to be the work of the HURS, the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Department, the HUR, their Ghost special unit, but it's not known when the strikes happened. However, in a separate statement today from the HUR, they said they'd also destroyed 2 Russian Be-12 Chaika amphibious aircraft in Crimea. They said their special unit Primari, which I'm told means phantoms, were responsible for the strike. These things, they're Soviet design, they're quite old, the Be-12. The Chaika, NATO reporting name is MAIL, M-A-I-L. It's an anti-submarine amphibious aircraft anyway, so increasing the number of attacks recently in occupied Crimea. And then just to bring us up to date, on the eve of today's 4th UN Security Council meeting since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russia's continued drone strikes against predominantly civilian areas, showing quite how serious Putin is for peace. 54 drones were fired on Saturday, of which 21 got through, and then last night 141 drones, with 132 being shot down, 9 getting through, hitting 7 places. Early this morning, 10 glide bombs were lobbed into Zaporizhia city. They killed 3 people there, taking to 8 the number of people killed across the country in the last 24 hours. And that whirlwind, Francis, is us up to date.
Well, thanks very much, Don. While significant, I don't think we should expect any revelations from this meeting of the Security Council. What may be of more importance are the meetings that take place behind closed doors between world leaders over the course of the General Assembly, also in New York this week. Now, long-suffering listeners will recall I visited the Assembly 2 years ago, and floating among the delegates, you see how the design of the space and the nature of the format promotes interactions, and a lot does happen behind closed doors there. I even saw a world leader eating a Mars bar, an image that immediately shatters the illusion that these people aren't human. So I'll never quite forget that. We already know that Presidents Trump and Zelensky will meet, with preparatory calls between the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Zelensky's Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak taking place over the weekend. There will be a large number of bilateral meetings, said Zelensky. Business, technology, defence, the minerals deal. This will be combined with a large economic meeting and a meeting with the President of the US. Also, very likely, a meeting between the First Ladies of Ukraine and the US on the humanitarian issue relating to children. So another example of the stolen children being on the political agenda now at the highest level, allowing Ukraine to liaise with its allies, if we can call the US still an ally at this point, that emphasises the human suffering as a result of Russia's actions, not just global security concerns. Now, we discussed last week how President Trump put the pressure on Europe to desist in its purchasing of any Russian energy and to place tariffs on China. Both policies also in accordance with his own foreign policy priorities, squeezing America's economic rivals, just as he sought to do with India, ostensibly to stop the war. Interestingly, that intervention has been utilised by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to accelerate the ban of importing Russian gas to the EU. As our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes writes, the ban will now come into effect in 2027 rather than a year later, and aims to starve Russia of funds for its war while also punishing Chinese businesses that benefit from cheap Russian energy. The bloc will also introduce a $47.6 oil price cap, preventing firms doing business on any Russian exports traded above that price. Von der Leyen put it more simply on Friday after our broadcast. It's time to turn off the tap. But how, I hear you cry at home, are they going to overcome that traditional Hungarian obstinacy on this? Well, basically by bribing them. The Commission will hand a €550 million bung to Budapest from the more than €22 billion of handouts destined for Hungary, but frozen over rule of law concerns, including LGBT rights and judicial independence. But it's actually even bigger than that. Brussels is also putting in place a mechanism to channel money to Ukraine from frozen Russian assets without needing unanimous approval, meaning Hungary's veto will no longer block aid. Officials are floating what they call a reparations loan. Now, it's all a bit complicated, but basically, under the idea, Brussels would place zero-coupon bonds on the market, underwritten by whichever member states volunteer to participate. Ukraine itself would only be obliged to cover repayments once Russia delivers compensation. And the mechanism could generate access to at least $170 billion. Berlin and Madrid have already indicated their backing, apparently, and the approach will allow the bloc to mobilise frozen Russian assets, as I say, without seizing them outright. an option EU policymakers fear would undermine the EU's standing as a global reserve currency. So a very interesting development, and one that we will continue to monitor. Both of those economic stories come hot on the heels of more announcements relating to the Russian economy. Putin is preparing to hit wealthy Russians with higher taxes, announcing this week that the Kremlin was considering reasonable measures on the rich, such as increasing levies on dividends or raising tax rates on luxury goods. Most significantly, I think, he openly used the war as a justification for this. He said, in the US during the Vietnam War and the Korean War, that's exactly what they did. They raised taxes specifically on people with high incomes. Now, as we've discussed several times lately, the most recent figures show the country's national wealth fund stood at $36.4 billion in June, down from a peak of more than $140 billion at the start of the invasion. Likewise, the number of registered businesses operating in Russia has fallen to lows not seen since 2010. So Russia's economy continues to face uncertainty amid high inflation, slowed economic growth, and near record interest rates, with trade sanctions also limiting access to markets for business. So it's a pretty gloomy picture at the moment on that front. And so is it any wonder that they've looked to one of Europe's greatest cultural events, Eurovision, for inspiration to detract from things? Now, I know you've been following this avidly, Dom, but just as a reminder, this weekend saw Intervision in Moscow. Okay. Its own version of the song contest, which, of course, they were banned from 3 years ago after the invasion. We were outraged here. Yeah. Now, you might be thinking it's just a new, cheap knockoff. You're wrong. Invasion's Freudian slip. Invision was founded by Soviet leader Brezhnev and was broadcast across the Eastern Bloc from the 1960s until the 1980s. You can tell I've been doing Wikipedia this morning. Now, opening the competition, Putin said that he revived it in celebration of trust between cultures and of each nation's free development and preservation of their identity. Now, no mention of the fact that he continues to funnel young men disproportionately from minority populations to the front lines. Now, performers from 23 countries, most of them allies of Russia, including China, Belarus and India, sung to compete for a prize fund. And I think this was also quite telling. So it was presented by a Chinese showman and an Indian actor, a very subtle way of signalling the relationship that's grown between Beijing and New Delhi. Now, Russia was represented by Shaman, I think I pronounced that right, a bleach blonde rock singer who's been an outspoken supporter for the war and himself was hit by EU sanctions for taking part in Kremlin-organised concerts in the occupied territories and recently performed in North Korea. After his performance, he said this. He asked the jury not to evaluate his performance. Hospitality is an integral part of the Russian soul, and I know that according to the laws of hospitality, I have no right to contend for victory. I represent Russia, and Russia has already won. Which is a rather interesting take on humility there. Now, the winner, Vietnam's singer, Duck Fuck.
I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it. It's just alienated.
I know you own all of Duck Fuck's records.
Oh, God.
But anyway, sorry.
I'm trying to reach out to people here. I'm trying to broaden our audience. You've just alienated an entire country.
Sorry. Enough of us. If answers on postcard, please. How do you pronounce his name? I do apologise for any Vietnamese.
Relatives of mine are Vietnamese.
Sorry, anyway.
I went to Hanoi for a wedding.
Any reflections on Intervision, Dom? I know you've been deeply insulted by comparisons with Eurovision over the years.
Well, I didn't even know about Intervision or Invision or whatever you called it until I heard this. But look, I'm all for it. I'm all for it because Eurovision is supposedly just Europe, although quite how Australia sneaks in there, I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, fine. If they want to have a nice sing-song, that's all very good. And the more people that are invited to Intervision or whatever, Invasion Vision, that then wonder why Russia's not in Eurovision and maybe does their own Wikipedia search or thinks about it at the very least. Fine. And if they come to the conclusion that, they've had to set up their whole new Invasion Vision thing themselves because they were kicked out of Eurovision for invading Ukraine, then I'm all for it. So absolutely, let them have their moment. I'm sure it's a worthy contribution to world cultural offerings.
Yeah, well, if you want to see some clips from that, we've got a link in the show notes to one of our stories written. I think it took 4 journalists from the Telegraph to cover Intervision this year. I think it was just such a bizarre spectacle. But anyway, we'll link to that so you can learn more about the propaganda elements of it. Now, Dom, I think it's worth us having a reflection here on a few other subjects that we've been talking about recently. And of course, the major one today is what you were just talking about there at the top about not shooting down of the jet that took place above Estonia. And that's really what I wanted to ask about, which is in 2015, Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet that violated its airspace. Suffice to say, there's been no such violations since. Why didn't Estonia do the same instantly, Dom? When a fighter jet crosses your border, why don't you just fire the missiles?
Well, I can't speak for the Estonian Ministry of Defence, but I would have thought they would say, obviously, it's a very serious act to use armed military force against another entity and potentially kill someone. So you've got to be very mindful of that, of course. You can fire back if you are under armed attack or imminent armed attack, this idea about sort of preemptive self-defence. You can fire back to preserve the sanctity of your airspace, so they would have been perfectly entitled to do so. But it is a massive step, obviously, and the context is all important. That 2015 incident where the Russian jet operating in northern Syria flew inside Turkey and was shot down, that was, well, so far, much more violent, as much as it ended in the shooting down of the jet and killing the pilot. But paradoxically, it was actually more limited because the wider context, there wasn't wider tension between Turkey and Russia at the time. So in a bizarre way, it was actually quite a self-contained incident, albeit extremely violent. This would be very different, given the context, the war in Ukraine, the violations of NATO airspace. And of course, that's what Russia is playing on. So, you know, it's not wrong to say that why didn't they shoot it down? And I refer you to Hanno Pavker's comment when I interviewed him earlier this year that he said at the time it was only in the airspace for a minute, so they didn't have time. This time there was 12 minutes, so perhaps they should be better prepared. But regardless, it shouldn't have come as a surprise. There should be a better response. And I note these comments by the NATO spokesperson and by Petra Pavel. I kind of almost want not to hear a response, or just to hear one coherent response from somebody about what's going to happen, or perhaps we, the public, should hear nothing and then the actions speak next time it happens, because this is what Russia is trying to do. It's trying to find the edges between the alliance members and push on them and see what they can come up with. Now, I did see a comment online earlier today by Etienne Marcuse from the French defence and security think tank FRS, the Foundation for Strategic Research. He was saying that there were photos, I haven't seen these photos, but he said there were photos of the MiG-31s released by the Swedish Ministry of Defence. He said that one of them had what he called a defensive air-to-air configuration, i.e. he said it was only carrying 4 short-range R-73 missiles. These are air-to-air missiles for shooting down other planes, that kind of thing. He said only one aircraft is visible, but it is reasonable to assume that if one of the other 2 had a more offensive configuration, such as a Kinzhal aeroballistic missile or long-range R-37M air-to-air missiles, it would have been shown, as in the Russians would have flashed it to the camera. He says, once again, the MiG-31s did not constitute an imminent threat. OK, fine, but I say, why is it reasonable to assume that? Why are we doing Russia's work for them? Why are we guessing what was on the other aircraft? We should respond to the threat as we literally and analytically see it. And even if these jets were only armed with defensive air-to-air missiles, they still constitute a threat, because it means that any aircraft that went up to meet them, to shepherd them off, or to fire warning shots, or to get a radar lock on them and intimidate them, let alone try and shoot them down, they would be in danger because they've got these air-to-air missiles. And why would you unnecessarily put your own people in harm's way? And by saying, don't worry, it's only a little bit worse than what they did last time, that is just boiling the frog. So we had 1 aircraft earlier this year, we've had all these drones, we've now got 3 aircraft that are only armed with defensive missiles. What happens if next time, and there will be a next time, folks, what happens if next time it's only 1 Russian jet and it's only for 5 minutes in Estonian airspace or Latvian airspace or what have you, but it's armed with a Kinzhal missile? Is that too much of a threat? At what point, we're back to breach or reach, aren't we? But at what point do you say, right, shoot it down? Is that too much? Is that an armed attack? I just hope, as these aircraft were flying along, that they were thoroughly painted by Estonian air defence assets, i.e. they were left in no doubt at all, that they were vulnerable, they were locked on, all that kind of stuff. And I do hope that that's not the end of it. So I think it would have been quite a step, as Turkey did in 2015, quite a step to shoot down one of these aircraft. But What's next? And do you then fly some NATO jets through Kaliningrad, for example? I think it might have been a step too far right now, but what happens next time? And I do hope people have got a line, and then we just suddenly hear about it after the event when something goes bang.
Well, thanks, Dom. Last one. You were in Istanbul last week hanging out with your chums at Mi-6 and hearing the last speech from the departing head of the service, Richard Moore. Now, Keith in Melbourne wrote in asking this: why Istanbul rather than London? I thought it was a good question.
It is a good question. Thanks, Keith. I did actually ask that. I never really got a clear answer. I think it's because Richard Moore, he was ambassador to Turkey before he then took up the post as head of SIS, or Mi-6, Secret Intelligence Service, the formal name, Mi-6. So I think it's because he's got good pals there, and he went back, and he was obviously doing a lot of work as well. But I think it just holds great affection for him at Turkey. Interesting, though, I mean, so I dialed in on Friday from Istanbul airport. It was a bit noisy, so sorry about that. I hope it came across. I thought I'd found a nice quiet spot, and then a woman at a stand next to me started squeezing lemons and making a hell of a racket. Why are you smiling?
It's not a euphemism, is it?
No, it was actually. She was squeezing. Anyway, moving on. There was a lot of lemons squeezed. And so I hope it came across. But it is an interesting time. So Richard Moore's handing over to Blaise Machiavelli. Interesting time for all spy agencies, basically. He was there. One of the things he was announcing was a silent courier, this new dark web portal for people to be able to send any information directly to Mi-6. That sort of turns on its head the business model whereby SIS traditionally recruit agents and then they go and meet them and handle them and all the rest of it. But that business model of getting the information to come to you is not brand new, but it is certainly quite a novel use of technology. And explains part of the big problem these days is the advent of AI and big data, ubiquitous surveillance. It means it's very difficult to operate in Moscow and Beijing and all the other places. And plus just the sheer numbers. SIS is quite small. We don't actually know how many people work there, but it's thought to be the single-digit thousands compared to at least 20 times that in China. Not quite sure about Russia. But just the capacity to try and work these things, let alone the very hostile environment now. I was told some years ago, there's no shadows anymore, this idea. Any novel you might pick up, I don't know if you know any decent spy novels, Francis, but any novel you might pick up has always got some cloaked figure on the front standing in the shadow. There's no shadows anymore. You can't pretend to go into a country as a mining engineer or a journalist or something like that, because the data trail behind you just won't stack up to the third, fourth and fifth question. So big data, AI, that's a massive problem. So SIS, as well as other intelligence agencies, trying to work out how to continue operating in this regard. That is a massive challenge for them. It's interesting to see what the response is. So yeah, there's some big challenges there for the next head of SIS and her sort of 5-year tenure.
Yeah, I mean, I think when the history books are written of this era, one of the most noteworthy things is the degree to which the intelligence services have publicly articulated the predictions that they've made about the invasion, and not only that, the nature of the hybrid warfare and sabotage and all of those incidents that Russia has been carrying out for many years now. And I think that world leaders have been very hesitant to respond to both of those public calls that they've made. And so I think we should pay very, very close attention to what Mi-6 and what the CIA and other intelligence agencies say, because they've been proven more right than wrong, it feels, in this war so far.
Just to finish off on that, I hope they've wargamed this in Vauxhall Cross, because I said to one of their officers, I said, what happens when you launch this silent courier portal and next week Russia gets some poor urchin up in front of the cameras and they say, this ratbag was trying to send information to SIS through their new dark web portal, and of course we're all over it. We knew exactly what was happening and we went and arrested him very quickly. What have you got to say for yourself, Urchin? And Urchin says, I'm really sorry, Mi-6 tried to recruit, blah, blah, blah. So I said, have you got defensive comms in line for when that happens? Because that would be a very obvious response in a bid to turn everybody else off from using silent courier. I was assured they had. They've absolutely wargamed this, but I hope they have thought about it.
Thanks, Dom. We'll hear more from you in our final thoughts later on. But now over to an interview I did with the Kyiv Independent's Francis Farrell while he was here in London for the Ukraine Freedom Summit. This time, we spoke in more detail about the supposed Russian breakthrough several weeks ago, how maps only tell one side of the story, and as well reflected a little bit more on Ukrainian morale at the present moment. This is our conversation. Well, Francis, it's always a pleasure to see you. And this time you're in London, so it's great to be here and opposite you rather than over the screen. And sometimes we've had crackly lines when we've been speaking to each other when you've been in Kyiv or elsewhere in Ukraine. Let's start, as ever, with your assessment of the frontline situation at the moment. Of course, you're often bedded in with troops. You speak to many, many people. Interested in where you think we are at this moment, and then we can get into more granular detail about some of the fronts specifically.
Sure. Cheers, Francis. Great to be here in person. And yeah, it's an interesting time. Of course, people ask about, how did the Russian summer campaign go? But at the end of the day, the summer campaign doesn't end on August the 31st. We are continuing the same offensive operations that we've seen throughout summer into autumn. And it's worth remembering that last year, the gains that Russia made with every single month actually picked up every month until November. People think about the autumn mud or the bad weather or something like that. But when Russia is mostly attacking with dismounted infantry at that point, that stuff is less relevant. What is relevant is the foliage on the trees, the fact that that's just a very good way of hiding these infantry groups that kind of come forward slowly and try and infiltrate Ukrainian lines. That's the main reason we can expect to see things stabilize again over winter the way they did last time. But in the meantime, there's still plenty of fighting to do over autumn. I think if we look at the summer still, it's not a perfect summer for Russia. It's not a perfect summer for Ukraine at all. What we did see this really concerning push through near Dobropilya in August, which is, I think, unfortunately a sign of things still to come, which we'll get into. But in the meantime, Pokrovsk is still holding, which I think it's now about a year since Russia reached the outskirts of that city, and it really has been a kind of rock upon which Russia's hopes of overwhelming the rest.
Well, every time we speak, it's always Pokrovsk, yeah, isn't it? And yet they're still holding. I know the last time you were on the podcast, it was with Dom, and you were talking specifically about Pokrovsk, and you've been there. What's your assessment of the situation right now?
Well, the key fight there is actually for a town north of Pokrovsk. It's called Rodinske, and it's on the main road into Pokrovsk. The Russians are too close for the Ukrainians to be using that road now, but east of that town is a big coal mine where there's been a lot of intense fighting, and both sides kind of understand that if Russia can control that coal mine, they can really control the way in and out of Pokrovsk. And it's all an area that is under control from Russian drones. But if the Russians get just that extra bit closer, they can start using standard FPVs, not just fiber optic. And it's really difficult to imagine how Ukraine can hold on for too much longer there, because the Russians are getting better at not only isolating ground-based logistics, but also knocking out these heavy bomber drones from the sky. I was talking to some infantrymen. They'd been on positions for months, and they were saying that, yes, everyone was trying their best to resupply them with drones. No one could come on foot anymore. But even then, it was so difficult at one point that they were struggling with food and water and basic supplies at certain points. So we can see that in the current battlefield environment, I would say, because Ukraine has got its side of the front line really well covered by effective drone units, both in the brigades that are holding front lines and these larger specialized drone units everyone knows about, Magyar and Nemesis, unmanned systems forces. That means that it's still basically impossible for Russia to achieve a real breakthrough of the kind like we saw with the Ukrainian counteroffensives or the Kursk operation. But on the other hand, the Russian drone saturation on their side is causing huge problems for the Ukrainian defense, making life miserable for infantry, really getting better at targeting Ukrainian drone pilots, which of course limits Ukraine's ability to actually defend properly. And we're going to see that, I think, go forward into the autumn and winter.
Well, you mentioned Dobropilya and the assaults that took place there. This is, of course, just to remind listeners, the inverted commas breakthrough that was talked about just around the Alaska summit time. And of course, we on the podcast since then have poked a lot of holes in some of the analysis that was made at the time by many as to who got, well, rather carried away because of the political context of the moment. But nonetheless, it was significant. And I think one of the things that it revealed was the apparent, in certain sectors of the front, porousness of Ukrainian defensive positions, if that's fair. And so I'm interested in your assessment on that and more broadly about the Ukrainian defensive structure, because I think a lot of listeners obviously know about the drone wall, but they won't necessarily know that it's not all strong First World War style trenches all along the rest of the lines.
I think that it's not really useful in a kind of battlefield tactical environment, which is dominated by drones, and it's something that we've never seen in military history before, to argue about whether this quite unique operation was a breakthrough or a breach. If you say a breach, you're assuming that there are some kind of lines to breach, and the problem here is that there weren't really lines per se. So what happened was, we're talking about a few hundred Russian infantrymen who were supported by drones, and they're supported not only by drones that are resupplying them and guiding them through the holes in the Ukrainian defense, but the commanders told us that they also, in their assault groups, they bring drone pilots with them just to have constant, immediate reconnaissance and being able to move forward. So this happened for three reasons. It happened first and foremost, as you mentioned, because of the porousness of the Ukrainian defense. It's no secret that Ukraine's very low on frontline infantry, and those frontline infantry are living in conditions that we can't really imagine ourselves. They're sitting in holes, in dugouts for months at a time, and they understand that if they come out of those holes, that they will most likely be spotted and just smashed with whatever Russia has. Drone-dropped bombs, FPVs, Molnias, maybe glide bombs, artillery. And so often it's actually not in their interest to come out of their holes and fight and hold the front line. But even if they did, they're just very thinly spread. So we're talking about often hundreds of meters between individual infantry positions, which even a year ago might have been held by 5 or 6 people and now are held by 2 or 3. And so that's what the front line looks like on the Ukrainian defensive side. But on the Russian attacking side, they're also adapting to this, and they can't attack with big mechanized groups either. They can't even attack with large groups of infantry, big clumps either. So their solution, which also increases their survivability, but also allows them to pass through the Ukrainian lines, are these infiltration tactics. Sometimes not even a group, sometimes individual soldiers who are just wearing camouflage suits and they're moving forward at 50 meters at a time, and then they'll lie down in a field for another hour, or they go through the tree lines. But in this context, it's really hard, especially when there's a lot of foliage, to stop them. And so when you've got porous front lines and you've got these Russian infiltration tactics, and they have a specific plan to go through in a specific area where it really suits the chances of success, it's quite common all across the front line. And then the Ukrainian and Russian positions start to overlap. But some brigades, they can deal with that, and they know where the Russians are, they keep track of them, and they make it impossible for them to go further. But here, and this is getting to the third reason, this was an area with poor coordination between Ukrainian units. This is what happens when you have maybe a brigade is in charge of that area on paper, but in reality, you've got companies and battalions chopped up. You've got some random, maybe territorial defense infantry brought in to try and hold the front line. People aren't talking to each other properly. And when an infiltration like this happens, sometimes they don't tell the truth to their neighboring units about what's actually going on. And then when the Russians get through, they might start to come across Ukrainian drone units, Ukrainian EW units, Ukrainian mortar teams, FPV teams. And then maybe they're assaulting them, maybe they're ambushing them, maybe they're just bypassing them even further. But very quickly you have this kind of snowballing chaos where all of these Ukrainian drone teams, who are mainly responsible for stopping these attacks, they're Ukraine's main eyes in the sky, Ukraine's main fire assets, and suddenly they're being assaulted by Russians, or if they're not being assaulted, they understand the Russians are close, so they're trying to pack up and leave, and that's all time when they can't actually do their work. And meanwhile, the Russians just said, well, if we can keep going, we can keep going. And that's how they made it about 15 kilometers behind the so-called front line of Ukraine. And there's an interesting role here played by Deep State, the actual organization that produces the most reliable, not only mapping, but analysis.
And even Ukrainian soldiers themselves rely on this, don't they?
Very often. And that's always the biggest canary in the coal mine. And that's the role they played here. And unfortunately, many commanders said that they thought that Deep State played a very important role here because in an environment where nobody wanted to admit that something was going really wrong, they went out of their way and painted this concerning looking red two-pronged thing on the map. And so that's the next part of the story. Once everyone was up in alarm about this, then the reaction was quick and was really strong. The Azov Corps, which is, as we know, led by Denis Prokopenko, one of the most legendary Ukrainian commanders, they took over and it was brought under control. And it makes sense because we know that the Russians target weak points. So if there's this kind of firefighting and you really do bring some really strong Ukrainian units in to defend, well, that's actually going to be an area where the Russians will no longer see a weak point that they can go further. I guess the silver lining here is that this area, which really was a concerning area of advance because it compromises Pokrovsk from the north, it compromises Drushkivka and even Kramatorsk maybe from the west. Now it's been brought under control and we've really seen Russian gains slow down there. But of course, this is all happening in the context of an overstretched Ukrainian front line. And that means that ultimately other parts will be made weaker. And we've seen new movement near Liman, new movement near Kupiansk. We've seen the movement continue around the border area in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So, I mean, in that sense, nothing has really changed. So they are just trying to keep up the pressure and really get as much as they can before winter.
You spoke about that Deep State map and how important it was for stalling that developments on the battlefield. It was controversial, though, the way it was visualized, because it suggested, because of the nature of the map and how it looked, and obviously it was picked up by media around the world, that, okay, there are these fingers, and that means that they have seriously broken through, that any patch of red has thousands of men in, and that there's military support of all kinds, vehicles. And I just wonder your reflections on that and how, in a sense, sometimes maps cannot tell the whole story, and that we do maybe need to sometimes be very cautious when we look at them, because the methodology is to a certain degree incomplete, as any map is always going to be.
Yeah, so the maps don't tell the whole story, and especially now when there are, again, no cohesive front lines. And I've spoken to the Deep State guys, and they've spoken about how much of a pain it is, because people should understand that, yeah, very often there are no lines. It's dots that are overlapping. It's just little guys in a hole somewhere here and here and here. But the problem is now that they've become so important in the domestic context.
I'd argue internationally, given the context of Alaska and the other summits that were taking place at that time, it was picked up far beyond. And people were saying breakthrough and that this is disastrous, and it sets the tone for those meetings between Putin and Trump.
You could argue, but I think at the end of the day, the domestic context and the actual response by the General Staff to what was a development that we hadn't seen before on the front line was the main priority. And I mean, I can't imagine what was going through their head when they were making this decision. Were they worried about Alaska? It's hard to say, but I ultimately don't think that was a big swaying thing there, because we didn't hear Trump saying that they're falling back right now. They're about to lose if they don't take this deal. I mean, that was a bit of a separate reality TV show. But when it comes to the domestic context, it would have been really concerning to see, how long this leadership, which I have criticized before as being quite Soviet-minded, would go on pretending that there's no problem. And that's what they did when they first responded. The first responses by the spokespeople, they were like, oh, these mapping people, they have no idea what's going on. It's just like maybe a dozen guys and they're all being cleared right now. But come on, they moved the Azov Corps, they moved really big battalions there. It was obviously a much bigger problem. And it's a shame we're in a place where something like deep state actually really plays such a role.
Fascinating. Let's just change perhaps the parameters. I mean, obviously, politics, military, it's all one thing, but I want to get your sense at the moment and soldiers' sense that you speak to about the coalition of the willing statements recently. I'm skeptical to say they've been more assertive, but let's put it, if we were being generous, in these terms. There have been more vocal public and private articulations of what some kind of reassurance force could look like. There have been more discussions and more robust language about the prospect of being more assertive, potentially. What's your feeling on this? I mean, do you think that there is any real help to the military situation at the moment having these conversations? Because it's all being framed still around the idea of it being after some kind of peace deal or ceasefire. So where are we on this in your view, Francis?
I've made my opinion pretty clear on this before. Ukrainians do not feel reassured by what's going on at the moment. Nobody, whether they're journalists or soldiers, are looking at the developments and thinking, wow, maybe we're going somewhere. Maybe we're going to be fine after Russia magically decides to stop. Unfortunately, that's the case. And as you mentioned, it's putting the carriage before the horse, talking about how you're going to secure a peace without talking first and foremost about stopping Russia. And inside Ukraine, it's starting to feel like a sick joke, to be honest. It feels, and I wouldn't hold back from language saying along the lines of, it seems like the Europeans are lying to themselves about what they're ready to do, just so they can feel they're doing something, feel this momentum, feel the coalition of the willing. And I might be wrong. It might be true that behind this, real progress is being made towards braver decisions, but the fundamental nature of it is not logical, and I think it's actually harmful because it's wasting time. And it's giving every signal possible to Russia that it's in their interest not to stop. And so we've said this before, Dom said it, the road to stopping Russia now and the road to a peace, which all Ukrainians want, and the road to actually securing that peace is the same road. And it's very simple. It starts with the most drastic and brave steps possible to pressure Russia from all angles. And it's all things we've talked about before, like, yes, closing sanctions loopholes, yes, aggressively ending any purchases of Russian oil, and if possible, working with the Saudis to lower the oil price and all of that. Convincing the Belgians to finally, again, be brave and release these frozen assets. But now, again, we need to talk about active presence inside Ukraine without a ceasefire. Again, the Sky Shield ideas, the training inside Ukraine, which has a useful effect for everyone, and thinking about, moving brigade level forces inside the country, not to the battlefield, but just somewhere into Western or Central Ukraine, because otherwise more territory will be lost and things could speed up. The front line on Ukraine is being held, as we talked about, by humans, by infantry. And that doesn't run on the timeline of Europeans slowly maybe thinking about doing something now and not in the future. And as I said before, the idea of a stable stalemate is an illusion. And what happened in Dobropilya was an example of that. Again, going back to the battlefield, the other really concerning development we've seen recently have been Russian drone attacks on very key Ukrainian logistics routes in the rear, which the main ways of getting into the cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are now starting to be targeted by FPVs. And I don't know, as a journalist, for example, next time I go out there, how I'll even get there. Is it even going to be possible to stay in Kramatorsk like we always did? It's not quite there yet in complete crisis mode, but it's only going in one direction. And so everyone from inside Ukraine is, unfortunately, I wish this wasn't the case, but we're looking at this as just pure circus, to be honest.
Well, Francis, we've covered a lot of territory. And I think that is the optimum word, really. Is there anything that we've not spoken about that you'd like to leave listeners with?
I think another thing we are noticing from inside Ukraine is interest from the West dipping even more than we've seen previously. And I just see very few international media doing reports from the front lines at all at the moment. We still try, and you're still doing your thing every day, of course. But for those who do follow and care about Ukraine, it's definitely not the time to tire out, because again, the front line is being held by Ukrainian soldiers. I spoke to those who were for 5 months on positions, and if they felt the same kind of fatigue that maybe some people far away in Europe are feeling, that maybe we should just switch off and let it go, then we enter the most catastrophic timeline possible for Europe. If we're talking about Ukraine falling, we're talking about Russia bearing down on a Europe that has no idea how to fight this kind of war. It's not where we want to be. So once again, especially for Europeans, just see Ukraine's fight as your own and act accordingly.
Let's dive into our final thoughts now then. Just a quick reminder that our in-person episode and question and answer session at the Honourable Artillery Company on the 22nd of October here in London. Tickets are now available. We've got a special panel this, because it's General Sir Richard Barrons, former head of the UK Joint Forces Command and latterly one of the authors of Britain's Strategic Defence Review, and Orysia Lutsevych, head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Tickets are open to everybody, but there aren't so many of them as we would like. So if you are keen to get one and to see us there, the link in the show notes will be there. We really look forward to meeting. It's been quite a while since we've done a live event, so it's always a great pleasure to meet many of you there. So we look forward to that. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners today?
Thanks, Francis. So I'm going to leave you, if I may, with a book. So I'm sorry, folks, I've given up on Ulysses. I managed about 120 pages and then my brain just exploded. So I've given up on Ulysses, but I'm sure you can tell me why that's wrong. I haven't said, I'm now thoroughly enjoying Eastern Approaches by Fitzroy MacLean, written in 1949, his memoir of his time, including his time as a diplomat in the Soviet Union of the 1930s. And I'm reading this, and two passages in particular that leapt out at me, and I think they offer a helpful insight into the mindset that we're facing in Putin's Russia today. And I was reminded of these when I saw over the weekend Andrei Kelin, who's Russia's ambassador here in London, just flatly deny that their jets had flown through Estonian airspace on Friday. And yet again, I was left thinking, how do they think they can get away with it? How can they lie with such straight faces? How can they be apparently so convinced that black is white, up is down, and why do they think that we will go along with this? So I was looking at that, and then these two passages leapt out at me from Eastern Approaches. The first one, let me read it to you direct. He said, the Soviet authorities, bear in mind this is written in 1949 about his time in the 1930s, the Soviet authorities do all they can to encourage the theatre and ballet. Perhaps they see in them a relatively harmless outlet for a turbulent imagination. By a fortunate dispensation of providence, Russians possess a natural gift of make-believe. Listening to Tchaikovsky's music and watching the transformation scenes of Swan Lake and the Sleeping Beauty unfold before them, they have the power to forget their troubles and miseries and transport themselves into a world of plenty, magnificence and romance, with nothing more frightening than an occasional witch or magician to take the place of the more substantial terrors of real life. For them, as for no other race, the real and the imaginary, the actual and the symbolic, the literal and the figurative tend to overlap and become one. I thought that was very telling. And then this second bit that I found about how did the Soviet people, and I directly relate it today with Russian people under Putin, how do they come to think as they do? A friend of mine who works closer to Russians than I do says they look like us, they like the same brands as us, they holiday in the same places as us, but they are very different to us. So this second passage, I think, illuminates that. It's based on one of Stalin's show trials that Fitzroy MacLean went along to observe. He said, all, judges and accused alike, had, for the greater part of their lives, been subjected to propaganda so constant, so intensive, so insidious, as to leave its mark on the strongest intellect. All had been cut off, as only Soviet citizens are cut off, from any contact with the outside world, from all normal intellectual and political influences, from all valid standards of comparison. In a sense, all their minds must work along the same lines, along different lines, that is, from the Western mind. So, why do I offer this as a final thought? Well, for two reasons. First, and I don't particularly like the politics of othering, the act of energetically looking for points of difference between races or countries and seeking to widen and exploit them. I seek not to divide here, but to explain. And second, as I know from my own experience and from the huge amount of correspondence that we get, it is easy to feel overwhelming anger at the likes of Andrei Kelin when his chuckly lies. It's so easy to feel so angry that we just end up disengaging. But that is what they want. Now, we don't want to end up as cynical and compromised and weak as Kelin is, and Putin and their entourage. We don't want to end up as weak as they are. So in an act of self-preservation, it is entirely reasonable and understandable to want to turn away, to want to not see the images of dead bodies, to want to not hear the reports about the daily brutality. And if that is how you feel, I totally understand it. And I don't blame you for wanting to take a break or for actually taking a break. This is a marathon, not a sprint, as we say often. So, take a break if you want. We'll be here for you when you come back. But please know this, you are not alone. You are not cynical. Your outrage means you are functioning correctly. So please listen again to those two passages that I've just read and know that the Russians are very good at this. They've been practicing it for generations. But know also that wherever you are not alone. You are part of a global community, and I do mean global. We've just passed 120 million downloads, and only about 1 million of them can be down to Francis's mum. Hello, Mrs. Dearnley. You will be helping yourself and Ukraine by not rising to their bait, but by staying calmly engaged as we get through this one day at a time. But I do recommend Eastern Approaches by Fitzroy MacLean. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.